and Peace was an extraordinarily important film in terms of Russian culture and the Soviet film industry. It was the first time that Russians had filmed this national classic, Tolstoy's novel, in the sound era. There were 5 Russian films made during the silent era, actually before the revolution. This was the only film that was given unlimited state support. It was the most expensive film ever made during the Soviet period. And I think it will remain the most expensive film ever made in Russian film history. War and Peace is considered by all Russians to be their greatest novel. The novel was written by Leo Tolstoy. Tolstoy was the most important of many important Russian writers in the 19th century. He came from an extremely distinguished and well-known Russian noble family. He had served as a military officer with distinction in Russian wars in the Caucasus mountain region, and he began writing while he was a soldier. When it was announced that he was going to write about the Napoleonic Wars, there was major excitement. When the novel appeared in serialized form, it was like a popular serial would be today, whether on television or streaming. It was the talk of all educated Russian society. Everybody was reading the book and really taking in its message about Russian might, the beauty of the Russian soul, the beauty of the Russian land. And the novel essentially created a myth of Russian resistance. Tolstoy's idea was that Russia had defeated Napoleon in 1812 through the Russian soul and the character of the Russian people, rather than through any particular military talent. So for the Russian people, reading this deeply patriotic, deeply soulful novel reassured them that if they could survive Napoleon's Grand Army, they could survive anything. And yet, because in the last 2 or 3 decades of Tolstoy's very long life, he had become a religious mystic, he was a very tricky figure for Soviet leaders to deal with. And so, although they were attracted to the novel War and Peace, they were fearful of drawing too much attention to Tolstoy and his religiosity. After Stalin's death, however, when Nikita Khrushchev had consolidated power and launched a period of cultural relaxation that was called the Thaw, making a film of War and Peace became increasingly possible. U.S.-Soviet relations during the Khrushchev era were particularly fraught because Khrushchev was a very volatile, unpredictable character. In 1958, during a period of relative relaxation in U.S.-Soviet relations, the Soviet government and the American government signed a cultural exchange agreement. And one of the first films that the Americans selected for distribution in the Soviet Union was War and Peace. That was very deliberate. Hollywood wanted to show that Americans could make Russian subjects better than Russians could. The film was extremely popular in the Soviet Union when it was distributed in 1959. It attracted over 30 million viewers. For Soviet film distributorship, that was a very good audience figure. However, Soviet filmgoers fell in love with King Vidor's movie not because of its historical accuracy, which they thought was awful, nor because of Vidor's rather feeble attempts to recreate Russian culture. They fell in love with the film because they fell in love with Audrey Hepburn. Many Russian filmmakers were incensed by the popularity of this film, that nobody could presume to make a better film adaptation of Tolstoy's War and Peace than a Russian filmmaker. Everyone decided that that insolent provocation had to be met. And it had to be met in a really spectacular way that demonstrated the superiority of the Soviet film industry. Soviet cinema had two high points as far as national recognition was concerned. The first was in the 1920s with the famous silent film directors like Sergei Eisenstein, Vsevolod Pudovkin, Alexander Dovzhenko. The second was in the Khrushchev era. At that time of cultural relaxation, Soviet filmmakers were allowed stylistic experimentation, and they were allowed to focus on individuals and the experiences of individuals rather than the experiences of the group. And so important films like Mikhail Kolotozov's The Cranes Are Flying, Grigory Chuk Cries, The Ballad of a Soldier, Andrei Tarkovsky's first professional film, Ivan's Childhood, appeared in international festivals, won international awards. And it's important to remember that the filmmakers that have attracted attention outside the Soviet Union are not the filmmakers that Soviet audiences loved. Not because their films weren't great, they were great, but because it suited Cold Warriors to point out how persecuted important artists were in the Soviet Union. And it's true, avant-garde artists did not adhere to the tenets of socialist realism. It was anathema to them to make straightforward, narrative, realist movies. But the fact is that Soviet audiences did not like their movies, refused to see them. The canon outside Russia is defined by the films that nobody saw. In 1960, after having been badgered by Russian cultural figures and intellectuals for nearly a year after the appearance of King Vidor's War and Peace in Russia, the Soviet state and the Communist Party decided to greenlight a War and Peace project. This was going to be what was called a state commission, a goszakaz in Russian, and that meant that the resources for making the film were likely to be very, very large. And so this was the kind of project that film directors in the early 1960s definitely wanted to compete for. Now, when Stalin was alive, he interfered in many, many ways in the making of films. And so directors feared being called upon to direct this kind of film. But under Khrushchev, film directors knew that they'd have much more creative freedom. And so this was the assignment to end all assignments. And most important Russian film directors vied for the opportunity. So it came as a surprise when Sergei Bondarchuk was selected for this assignment. Sergei Bondarchuk was a very well-known actor. He was born in 1920, so He was 40 when the decision came to greenlight the War and Peace project. As an actor, he had been a favorite of Stalin's. At the age of only 32, he was named a People's Artist of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union's most prestigious prize for creative artists. Bondarchuk was not the most obvious or popular choice to direct War and Peace, even though his first film, The Fate of a Man, was very highly regarded. The Fate of a Man was a small, intimate picture about a World War II POW and the difficulties he faced returning home. Yet, War and Peace was going to be a big film, a grandiose film, an epic film. And there was feeling that Bondarchuk had never demonstrated that he had the ability to make this kind of film, and that the assignment really should go to someone like Ivan Peryev, who had made big films in the past. A second reason was that he was young. Now it was good for the younger generation of up-and-coming filmmakers who chafed against the domination of the older generation of Soviet filmmakers. But it was those older filmmakers who had the power, and they thought it was bad that they were overlooked in favor of a relatively inexperienced and relatively young upstart. Another factor that played against him was that he was not a Communist Party member. The best-known directors of the older generation were all party members, and yet Bondarchuk had skillfully avoided becoming a member. Another factor was that he came from a rural background, and he did not have the cultured urban background of most members of the Soviet cultural elite. And so although no one would dare express that they thought of him as a country bumpkin, there is little doubt that they, in fact, did think of him that way. The final reason was that Bondarchuk was not very well liked among his peers. He was a fairly egotistical, arrogant, and dictatorial person. He had risen far very fast. There was the feeling that he had not paid his dues and that he wasn't sufficiently respectful of the experience of his peers. The members of the film community who looked down upon Bondarchuk and felt that he wasn't cultured and sophisticated were dead wrong about him. He was extraordinarily intelligent with a strong visual sense. He cared deeply about Tolstoy's novel, was determined that he was going to represent its spirit faithfully, that he was not going to do what he believed King Vidar had done, which is just take some aspects of the story and throw them on the screen. He also studied the historical period very carefully. He prepared for a year doing the research as he and Vladimir Solovyov were writing the script. The logistical aspects of this film, considering its cast of thousands, its vast expense, its extraordinary length and scope, are mind-boggling to consider. There were 300 speaking parts and thousands upon thousands of actors were auditioned. I would imagine when it came to the end that virtually every important actor in stage and screen, was auditioned for this film. Bondarchuk had, from the beginning, a very clear idea of what he wanted. And he was extremely frustrated by two things. First, many of the actors that he most wanted to work with knew him pretty well because he was an actor. And they did not think that they would like to work with him for 3 years. They thought the filming would take 3 years. It ended up taking longer than that. Bondarchuk first cast as Prince Andrei, one of the key roles, of course, a very charismatic and handsome actor, Innokenty Smoktunovsky. Smoktunovsky did not want to play that part. He wanted to play Pierre, but Smoktunovsky was eventually bullied into accepting the part. But when another well-known director, Grigory Kozintsev, deliberately sabotaged Bondarchuk by luring Smoktunovsky away to play Hamlet, Bondarchuk was furious. He pleaded with the Minister of Culture. He pleaded with his friends in the party to prevent Smoktunovsky from doing this, but it was to no avail. And then the Minister of Culture, Yekaterina Furtseva, she suggested Vyacheslav Tikhonov for the role. And he is the actor who eventually got the role. Bondarchuk did not want to hire him. He knew Tikhonov very well. They had been students together at the State Film Institute, and he, for reasons that are not at all clear to me, did not believe that Tikhonov was a good actor. Furtseva, the Minister of Culture, finally insisted that Tikhonov be given the role. And Tikhonov's relations with Bondarchuk were extraordinarily poor throughout the making of the film. Bondarchuk bullied him mercilessly, and Tikhonov practically had a nervous breakdown. The role of Pierre is the second important role in this film, and all leading actors in Soviet cinema were furious when Bondarchuk decided to give himself that role. And it was clear from the beginning that he auditioned other actors for the role, but his heart wasn't in it. Bondarchuk was a good actor, and I think he's very good as Pierre in this film, but he was far too old for the part. Pierre was supposed to be in his mid to late 20s in the film, and Bondarchuk was already in his 40s by the time the filming started. So there was a lot of mockery in the film community and at what they regarded as his egoism. The third important part was very difficult to cast, and that was the role of Natasha. Bondarchuk did not want to cast a well-known Soviet actress in this part. He felt that King Vidor had made a terrible mistake casting a beautiful and charismatic actress like Audrey Hepburn as Natasha, because Natasha was supposed to be naive, unformed, and very, very young. And so there was audition after audition. And finally, one of his assistants discovered a young ballerina, Ludmila Savyalova, and according to Bondarchuk's own recollections, there was dead silence after the audition, and Bondarchuk exclaimed, "There she is." Bondarchuk thought of himself as an actor's director, and he presented himself that way to his actors. With the exception of Savyalova as Natasha, however, all of the other actors were suspicious of his ability to work collectively, which was the terminology that was not surprisingly used in the communist USSR. And so the reports that the actors made in their various reminiscences about the film are quite mixed, but leading toward the negative. Sabyelova worshipped him, although she said that she was very much afraid of him because he was so stern. But most of the rest of the cast talked about his bullying, that he would force them into take after take after take. Bondarchuk himself, in an unguarded moment, said that the director is the czar and the god on the set. And I think that describes his directing style better than his saying that he's a friend of the actor. The production looks authentic because, to an extraordinary degree, it is authentic. The set pieces are real historical artifacts. The government opened all 58 historical museums of the USSR to Bondarchuk. So the furnishings, the paintings, the plates, the decorations, the jewelry, virtually everything is an actual priceless historical item that museums were forced to lend to the production. The costumes were handmade by seamstresses, copying historical textiles and historical designs. There were about 25,000 costumes, uniforms, and so forth made for this production. The weapons were meticulously copied from historical designs. Bondarchuk was so committed to historical accuracy, and for Natasha's ball, he actually got approval from the Soviet state to fly in hairdressers from Paris to coif the lady's hair. So the commitment to the look of the film was very profound. The Soviet Ministry of War assigned 5 or 6 very high-ranking generals to the project to ensure historical accuracy of the representation of the Russian army during the Napoleonic Wars. It's interesting, however, that American critics at the time, when the film was released in the US in 1968, did not like the battle scenes and felt they were too confusing, too chaotic. That was entirely Bondarchuk's point, as it was Tolstoy's point. Bondarchuk was a World War II veteran, although his primary role was as an entertainer. He understood what war was like, and it was very important to him, as it was to Tolstoy, to represent the war as horror, not some kind of neat game. Bondarchuk's difficulty in dealing with cinematographers is very similar to the problems that he had with his cast. The first cinematographer, Vladimir Monakov, left before any shooting actually started. The second set of cinematographers were a husband and wife team, Alexander Shelenkov and Yulan Chen. They had made some important films, like the World War II classic Zoya. They were responsible for the first 6 months of filming. They filmed the battles at Schöngraben and Austerlitz, which are extremely well done. The problem was that they were very, very slow. They would insist on take after take after take, when even Bondarchuk thought it was right. They disagreed. So they were arguing constantly. So Shelenkoff and Chen wrote to the studio and to the Minister of Culture that they could not work with this monster, Bondarchuk, that they were much more important artists than he was. And they absolutely, positively quit and would never, ever, ever come back. And so Fortseva, the Minister of Culture, decided to assign the second cameraman, Anatoly Petritsky, who had been the lead cinematographer on only one extremely minor film before that. Bondarchuk was not happy, and he let Petritsky know that he was not happy at having such an inexperienced cameraman as the cinematographer on such an important film. Petritsky and Bondarchuk argued constantly throughout the filming, and Petritsky quit on at least 2 occasions. The second time he quit, he actually tried to sign on to another film. And it was at that point that the head of the Mosfilm studio told him, in no uncertain terms, that he was not to do that, and that he was to get back on the set, that he was to stay there, and that if he refused, that he would never work again. And yet, Petritsky, as the results of the film demonstrate, quite remarkable. It was his idea in Natasha's ball scene to put the cameramen on roller skates to create the intimacy of that scene among the dancers. He wanted to incorporate crane shots in his indoor scenes. And so the pavilion at the Mosfilm studio, where they constructed the interior for Natasha's ball, had a number of towers built to allow the dancers to be shot from overhead. Another remarkable aspect of this film is all of the aerial work provided by the Soviet Air Force, planes and helicopters for many of the aerial shots, which Bondarchuk wanted once again to show the scope of battlefields. Petritsky's work in the Moscow fire scene, I think, was particularly innovative. They built a replica set on location of old Moscow, and Petritsky constructed tracks all around and through the set for the cameras to capture the sense of constant motion through this scene. The way Bondarchuk and Petritsky used cinematic devices, cinematic style, was, I think, very interesting and often against the grain, at least of what those of us who are most experienced with the Hollywood idiom would expect. Many of the shots are filmed long shot when you would least expect it. An example that I particularly like is the engagement scene between Prince Andrei and Natasha. Prince Andrei has asked for her hand. Natasha's mother tells her to go to him in the drawing room. And instead of this scene being shot close up to show the two embracing and so forth, it's shot in long shot with them at opposite ends of a room before they eventually move in for their embrace and a close-up. And what this means for me is that Bondarchuk is anticipating the fact that they will never be a couple. And what this does is make the close-ups very special, because they are used much more infrequently than they are in the typical Hollywood film. And also the scene where poor hapless Pierre is essentially bamboozled into marrying Hélène Kuragina, beautiful and stupid. There's a split screen. The split screen is not an artificially imposed split screen, but the characters are split by the wall that divides them, that shows her parents sitting worriedly, wondering what's going on. Her father then rushes in and congratulates Pierre on his proposal and says it's fine with him. And Pierre is just stunned. And the camera moves in for a close-up of his stunned face. Hélène tells him to take off his glasses before he kisses her. And so in this point of view shot, we see a close-up of Hélène's face, except we can't see it because we're seeing it as Pierre sees it without his glasses. It's totally blurred. A daring way to present that scene, I think, and it works 100%. Bondarchuk was very concerned that given the scope of the film, that he might lose its intimacy. As a novelist, Tolstoy was able to maintain that intimacy with characters very, very well. Bondarchuk wanted to retain that, especially through his point of view shots and his very careful and sparing use of the close-ups. And so another unusual use of the close-up is that he doesn't use close-ups only for his lead actors, but also for the extras. When the camera is panning a long line of Russian soldiers to remind us these are real people. Bondarchuk's War and Peace took some 5 years from start to finish. When Soviet films had complicated production histories in the past, before Bondarchuk, it was almost always because of censorship interference. Bondarchuk's film did not face censorship interference. This was a film of enormous scope with thousands of actors, hundreds of crew members, a virtually unlimited budget. The production process had to do with scope, had to do with logistics, had to do with management. All the moving parts that Bondarchuk and his very large crew had to deal with. A lot of this film was shot on location, which is fairly unusual for a Soviet film. Most of the time, they preferred to shoot on the sound stages in the studios. So Bondarchuk was really taking a chance in insisting that everything that was supposed to be outdoors was really shot on location. When he sent minions off to scout locations, for example, it could take months before they came back to him to recommend a location. And just waiting for the right weather conditions. That is also an aspect, definitely, of explaining why the film took so long to make. There were other problems, and an important one was the very poor quality of Soviet cameras and film stock. Bondarchuk had begged to be allowed to purchase Kodak film and to buy German cameras. He was refused. This is, I think, the only evidence that I've ever found that he was refused anything. But I understand this from the point of view of the state and the party. If this film were going to be trumpeted as its answer to King Vitor's War and Peace, it had to be entirely Soviet. They couldn't use American-made film stock or American-made or capitalist-made equipment of any kind. Anatoly Petritsky, the cinematographer, reported there were mosquitoes in the emulsion, that the film was often unusable, that the sprockets didn't line up, that the cameras were constantly breaking down. They didn't have the spare parts that they needed to repair them. They also had problems with the lighting, which of course was very important, especially for the indoor scenes. The lighting supply, even in Moscow, was available in fits and starts. Sometimes it was too hot. It would melt the artist's makeup. It went on and on and on. The budget of the film, to use the term budget in the American or Western sense, is really a misnomer. Soviet films very often had open-ended budgets and open-ended schedules, which strikes us in a capitalist system as odd, unbelievable, unthinkable. The official cost of the film was $29 million. That, however, is totally misleading, in my view, because virtually nothing was paid for. The salaries of cast and crew were actually paid for with real rubles. Most of the costs of the film were free. In other words, no money was transferred to the military for the use of those 15,000 soldiers for month after month after month. They were not reimbursed for the use of their planes and helicopters and pilots. The museums were not reimbursed for the years that they lost use of these valuable items for exhibit purposes. And so when you try to determine how much this film cost, it's really impossible. The best recent figure is $700 million in today's dollars. I have seen figures that go as high as $1 billion. War and Peace was released in 1966 to the Soviet public. Parts 1 and 2 were released together within a week of each other. And the initial audience response was really extraordinary. Nearly 60 million people saw parts 1 and parts 2. That's compared to 30 million for King Vitor's film, which was a very popular film by Soviet standards. But the third and fourth films were not released until 1967, shown months apart, and they did not do well at all. The box office fell precipitously, and it's hard to know why. Bondarchuk had originally wanted the film to be shown in 2 parts, not 4 parts. But the studio insisted that it be released in 4 parts because they felt it would be more palatable for the audience. Bondarchuk was afraid that the audience would lose interest if it were sort of doled out part by part, and I think that is a partial explanation of what happened. I think another part of the explanation is that there was a real rise in television ownership at right about this time, and fewer Soviets were going to the movies. There was also at this time a really pronounced move on the part of the Soviet movie-going audience in favor of asinine comedies, really lightweight fare. And although Bondarchuk always had the audience in mind, it's a serious film. And by 1967, the time had passed for that among Soviet moviegoers. However, War and Peace enjoyed great success abroad, especially in France and in Japan. That didn't really matter. What Mosfilm wanted, what Bondarchuk wanted, was American approval. Initially, they didn't think they were going to get it, because when the film was shown in the U.S. in 1968, Walter Reed of Continental Distributing made the decision to dub it. And the dubbing of that film was even worse than usual. But War and Peace was the first Soviet film to win an Oscar for Best Foreign Language Film. However, just in case they didn't win, the state decided that they would only send Lyudmila Sabyelova. Bondarchuk did not attend. It would be too embarrassing if he lost. But Sabyelova, all right. And all of it was worth it. All of it was worth it. Because for them, it was that shining moment where they had actually put Soviet cinema on a par with Hollywood. Bondarchuk's fate after War and Peace is sad. He wanted to become a European filmmaker, and he had an opportunity to do so. Dino De Laurentiis, who had produced King Vidor's version of War and Peace, decided that he wanted to make an epic film on the Battle of Waterloo, which interested Bondarchuk greatly because it's part of the same Napoleonic story. And that film did not turn out well. Bondarchuk did not speak English. He had no creative authority over the film. De Laurentiis was responsible for most of the casting, and much of it was disastrous. Rod Steiger as Napoleon, awful. The film was trashed. It lost money. Bondarchuk had to go home to the Soviet Union with his tail between his legs. And in 1970, the year of that debacle, he finally joined the Communist Party. He really had to, in order to salvage his career, to prove that he was a politically reliable filmmaker. For the rest of his life, he mainly acted. In 1985, Bondarchuk was in a really bad position, and he was denounced at the Congress of Filmmakers by the young directors as a hack, as a fraud, as a party toady. Only one director, Nikita Mikhalkov, stood up to defend him, and he died really isolated and alone in 1994. Soviet film critics did not give this great film very good reviews at that time. Those who are still alive have expressed regret for being so unfair to the film and have said it's because they didn't like Bondarchuk. They now feel, Russian film historians and Russian film critics, that nobody but Bondarchuk could have made this film, partly because of his creative instincts, his creative genius, his real understanding of film as a medium, but also because of his perfectionism and his certainty that he alone knew how to make this film right. And the result is a film that I would argue CGI cannot replicate. The fact that all of this is real shows in every single frame. And all you have to do is to look at any present-day film epic, compare it to Bondarchuk's film to see how artificial it is, or take Bondarchuk's film and compare it to King Vidor's and see how paltry Vidor's film looks by comparison. Bondarchuk was able to out-Hollywood Hollywood. And I think it was that his authoritarian nature that made it possible for this film actually to come to a conclusion. I can easily see where a less strong and overwhelming personality might just have given up. I certainly cannot see a director who really sees himself or herself as just one member of a team pulling this off. So I think Bondarchuk was the right man at the right time.
Голубчик ты мой, а девочку-то? Девочку-то? Девочку куда я дену, коли она не ихняя?
Qu'est-ce qu'elle veut, cette femme?
Чего ей нужно? Она несет мою дочь, которую я спас из огня. Прощай.